Okay, so this is my 5th try at this. I hope it sticks. So what we're going to do now is we're going to create the DBContext and the database and the tables. So what I've got here is I've done the SQL Server Object Explorer. So if you go to View, you can go SQL Server Object Explorer and you can view that. I've connected to my local database server. By default, it connects to some weird DB local thing that's part of Visual Studio. I like to use SQL Server. And then down here, I've opened the Package Manager console. The Package Manager console is, so if you go View, Other Windows, Package Manager console, it is the console version, the command line version of the thing that I use to add in those packages. So when I added in Entity Framework Core .design and .tools and .SQL Server, I did those from a graphical user interface version of the package manager. This is the console, but it also allows you to activate some of those tools and use them. So what we need to do first is create a database that we're going to be using. So we're going to say database, add new database, and we're going to call it green pages. And as you see here, there's nothing in it, no tables, no nothing. We're going to create a file called, so we're going to say add class. This is going to be called something. So this is a DBContext. It's going to extend the DBContext class, which is part of the entity framework. The naming convention is usually something DBContext. So obviously we're going to call it green pages DBContext. And then in here, we're going to make it public. We're going to extend DBContext. Now, why is it red underlined? Because we need to create a using to tell it this is an entity framework DBContext. We could also have just said entity framework core .dbcontext if we wanted to. But anyway, so now we need to add the classes to the DBContext. So what that means is I could have here in this models directory 500 classes, it doesn't matter, and only 4 of them are tables. The reason that there will be tables in the database and that the database will interact with them is because I've added them to the model, to the data model inside of here. But how do I do that? I have to say db set, and then I do my class person, right? So this is these are properties. So prop, I could say prop, but I'll say public. Person. So why is that underlined? Because it doesn't know where person is located because it's inside the models. As you see here, it's green pages lib.models. So if I do a using on that, it'll turn on unturn, or I can just let it correct itself. It tries to guess and it puts in the models using, right? So so it wants to call it, it does a lot of good suggested names, right? People sounds perfect. These are objects though, they're not really people. So I like to still use, when I'm doing person, I do persons. Properties, I'm going to do for email address, and I'm going to do for address, and it'll try to suggest names for you, and it does a great job. See, if I do this, it'll say phone numbers. Sure, phone numbers. Email addresses. Sure, we'll do email addresses. Here, do addresses. Okay, so now we've added them to the data model. The last thing we need to do to the DBContext is tell it how to connect to the database. It does that with a connection string, right? And so the way we do that is we override the onConfiguring method of DBContext, and we just plug in our configuration string. So here we just type in override, and you press tab, and it starts it, space, and it tells you all the things you can override. This one's on configuring. And then the base of it is just based on configuring with Options Builder. I'm going to override that and say, instead, I want to set the connection string, use SQL Server, that, get the connection string by just going right-click Properties, and scroll to the top. Here it is, connection string. Okay. As you see here, it's got everything you need to connect to the database. So now it's ready to go. So now I've done everything I can in the code. So I'm going to tell the package manager console, hey, add the migration. So add dash migration. So what this is if I make more changes to the classes, I can add more migrations and it'll just do a little bit more code. So right now, this is the initial create. So that's what I'm going to call it. I'm going to do it from Green Pages lib. You can do it from either project, but Green Pages web doesn't have a DBContext in it. I had to switch to Green Pages lib in order to make this work. So this should give me any errors if there are any. You'll see what it's doing too, is it creates a migrations folder and gives you the actual code for creation of the database. Now this isn't SQL Server code. This is code that then is generated into SQL Server code and then ran on the database. We'll do that in just a second. But we can check it first. It created the primary key. It gave everything identities for our key fields. That's great. It did our string lengths we wanted. As you see here, state is 2, zip is 10. Everything was looking really good. It did all of our foreign keys. As you see here, relating phone numbers, person ID back to the person table, for example, right? This really helps out. So now what do? We have to apply this. So how do we do that? We do update dash database. Now what this should do is it should create all those tables with all of the properties that are here and everything will be great. Okay, so now that's done. So now if I refresh, you can see it added an addresses table with all the properties from the address. It created the foreign key properly. It really did a good job of creation of everything, and it's all tied together now. So now going forward, and we'll get to the code where we actually use these classes that write to the database, and you'll see how these work. But for the most part, we're good to go. One last thing is it did this migrations history, and we can view this data. And you'll see it created that initial create and just let you know, hey, these are the changes I've applied so far. So if I want to add a field to person for, gender or something like that, I can run the add migration again with a name, add field 1, and it'll do it again and it'll create another one of these migrations. And then I just say update database and it just updates the one thing it needs to update. It's pretty cool. All right, so that's it for this video, which the next video we'll start talking about using these classes and working on the pages eventually. So thanks.